The first rule of the Ukrainian counteroffensive: don't talk about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. That was the message of this video released by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense yesterday. Plans love silence, it reads. There will be no announcement of the start. The Russian Ministry of Defense, of course, ignored the memo. Their spokesman said that Ukraine had launched a large-scale attack in 5 areas yesterday along the front line in the east of the country in Donetsk. Complete with drone footage, which we can't verify, the Russians said the attack was thwarted and that the Ukrainians sustained heavy losses.
In total, the enemy deployed 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions. The enemy's goal was to break through our defences at what they believed were our most vulnerable sections of the front line. The enemy did not achieve its goals. It had no success.
In terms of the losses cited, Ukraine did not respond directly, but this former Minister of Defence was likely on message as far as Kyiv is concerned when he spoke to us today.
So they're constantly inflating their successes, and sometimes they just make them up. And we need to realize that this is happening over and over again.
The question everyone's asking: is this the beginning of the anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive? The Economist magazine, citing Western officials, is reporting that it does mark the start, with attacks also underway along other parts of the front line. There has been a significant increase in fighting in the last few days, but it's too early to say, based on that fact alone, whether the substantive counteroffensive has begun in earnest or not.
This war is full of tactical operations of all kinds in all different parts of the front. Some of them are successful, some of them not successful, but we're certainly not seeing anything major started already.
The brigades that the Russians cited as being involved in the attacks in Donetsk are not the sorts of crack assault teams that would typically be on the vanguard of a full-scale counteroffensive. That suggests that the fighting is still part of a probing exercise, looking for vulnerabilities in defensive lines that can then be exploited by more specialist units. These are some of the areas in Donetsk and Zaporizhia where the Russians said yesterday's large-scale attack took place. There was also more intense fighting on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Remember, though, the front line is almost 600 miles long, not including the Russian border with Ukraine in the northeast. Ukrainian authorities in Vovchansk, a border town, said 2 people were killed in shelling there yesterday. It's close to where Russian partisans claimed responsibility for a spate of attacks inside Russian territory recently. It's in these border areas where the information war came into sophisticated focus in the last 24 hours. This is a deep fake Vladimir Putin address. In Russia, several radio stations and local TV networks appear to have been hacked, and the fake address was broadcast announcing martial law in border regions and calling for evacuations. Conventional warfare leaves craters. Unconventional warfare sows panic. With that in mind, expect news of the Ukrainians conducting a host of attacks over the coming days and weeks. Together, they may very well be the start of the counteroffensive. But that doesn't necessarily mean that each individual location is the place where it will begin.
Warwick O'Brien. Well, I've been speaking to retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vinman, who was the top Ukraine expert on the US National Security Council. Now, he became famous as a witness in Donald Trump's impeachment trial, revealing how Mr. Trump tried to pressure Ukraine's President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden's son, Hunter. I asked Mr. Vinman what he thought a Ukrainian counteroffensive could realistically achieve this year.
So I have an outside scenario in which they could, frankly, break the Russian military's ability to sustain this war, which means that they get all the way down to the Sea of Azov, to the cities of Verdansk or Mariupol. That would be an astounding, successful offensive. Wouldn't say that this is entirely remote. The Ukrainians have been surprisingly effective, and the Russians have consistently underperformed. I think my base case is, frankly, a little bit more modest. I think the Ukrainians are going to have success on the order of what they were able to achieve in Kharkiv and Kherson, liberating swaths of territory, many hundreds of kilometers frankly, even thousands of kilometers of Russian occupied territory, all the way to cities like Melitopol, Svatoya, that's kind of in the Luhansk area, maybe even all the way to Lugansk itself. So those are quite reasonable objectives for them.
Now,
and that's going to be sufficient to put pressure on Putin to negotiate.
There is an awful lot of sort of propaganda clearly on both sides and video being put out. And it's difficult to know what to believe. So, what do you think you can safely believe in terms of sort of the facts of what happens over the next few weeks?
Sure. So the first thing that we can believe is that Ukraine has demonstrated a capability to attack Russia's vulnerable points. Ukraine has assembled a massive counteroffensive force, at least 9 brigades, likely 12 brigades. We're talking about tens of thousands of troops. And right now, everything else is highly speculative. What we could assume from what we've witnessed thus far is that Ukraine is going to be successful. It's going to achieve some effects. It's unclear that it's going to have these kind of windfall war-ending gains. I don't think Ukraine's been enabled, hasn't received enough equipment fast enough to do that, but it has achieved enough capability to strike out and liberate large swaths of territory. And that's pretty important when the narrative from the Russian side is that this is a frozen conflict. This does not necessarily have to be a years-long war. If Ukraine is as successful as I expect it to be, it's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on Vladimir Putin to either negotiate, mobilize hundreds of thousands of more troops, or try to hang on to what he can. His minimal gains, maybe the peninsula of Crimea, and negotiate.
I mean, nonetheless, we are looking well into next year at least, aren't we? And of course, that raises the question of the impact of the US election, where we could well see Donald Trump again in play. How do you think it will change the scenario on the ground if Trump is the candidate looking like he could win? How will that change how the Ukraine war looks?
I think frankly, the Republican Party in general is breathing life into this very deeply faltering campaign by Vladimir Putin. If anything, it's clear that the resolve continues forward. More weapons being provided to Ukraine, completely against this narrative that the West is looking to cut bait. And even into 2024, it's unclear that Trump has the wherewithal to be able to end this war and support for Ukraine very quickly, or that Russia is going to be able to hang on for that long. So in a lot of ways, it's a prayer, it's a hope, it's really entirely unfounded, but that's what the Russians are relying on to hang on. I think what we will see is towards the end of this year, maybe just to buy time, Putin might start negotiations and see if he could hang on for months longer. So this war could play out in a different phase to the end of 2023, but in Ukraine's favor.
Alexander Vinman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we're now joined live from Kyiv by Yuri Sack, who's an advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. Could you shed some light on what the Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, might mean when she says what is happening now? The defensive operation includes everything, including counteroffensive actions. Therefore, in some areas, we are moving to offensive actions. Does this mean it's begun?
Good evening, and thank you for asking me this question, because I think today there's hardly anyone apart from Ukrainian Minister of Defense and Ukrainian General Staff of the Armed Forces who has not said that the counteroffensive has begun. Now, what I know that Hanna Maliar, Deputy Defense Minister, what she means is that for us, for the Ukrainian Armed Forces and for the Ukrainian people, the counteroffensive has begun back in February 2022 when we were first attacked, because not a single day went by without us fighting this war of our survival, without us resisting this genocidal terrorist state, Russia. So, but again, what she means, which is happening today, is that we are beginning to move forward on certain parts of the front line.
Yeah.
We are carrying out probing attacks, and in some places we are moving forward 500 meters, in some 1 kilometer, but inch by inch we are liberating our land, and we were preparing for this for a long time.
Yes, and the defense always sometimes involves attack, because at the weekend there were also reports coming out of the government in Kyiv that, you know, you felt you still don't have enough weapons, that you don't have the jets that you've been asking for. And that presumably is always the case as well, that you always want more.
Well, indeed, we are still asking for weapons because this is, after all, the most intensive war since the end of the Second World War. We're still asking for F-16s because we understand that without fourth-generation aircraft, such as F-16s, Ukrainian air defense will not be complete, the Ukrainian skies will not be protected, and the Ukrainian cities will continue to be the target of massive missile and drone attacks. So, but at the same time, we understand that certain weapon systems that we are requesting our allies to provide us with, they are complex, such as F-16s. It's a platform, you know, for every one F-16 pilot, you need 25 engineers who are servicing and providing maintenance to the F-16's aircraft. So we understand that this cannot happen overnight. But one thing that we have learned during the last 15 months, that when you are standing up against an enemy so deranged and so treacherous as Russia, an enemy which has no regard for their own human life and is using their soldiers as cannon fodder, you have to fight a smart war. And this is exactly what we're doing. And fighting a smart war supposes not being very vocal about your plans. And you have seen, you know, how we have managed, for example, the Kharkiv counteroffensive, the Kherson counteroffensive. So we'd rather under-promise and over-deliver, first of all, to the Ukrainian people, even though we understand how, you know, everybody is obsessed now with the beginning of the counteroffensive. Of course.
No, but I mean, when it comes to the Ukrainian people, what do you think the effect of things like those images Russia pumped out today, purporting to show what they claimed was the killing of 250 Ukrainian forces and the destruction of dozens of tanks? I mean, does that have a demoralizing effect? I mean, it's surely over time, if there's much more of that, it will have an effect.
All Ukrainian people, without exception, small and old, and, you know, we all understand and know, and we see and we perceive Russian leadership as propaganda clowns. You know, if you believe Russian propaganda, their Ministry of Defense, then, you know, they've claimed that they have gained control over Bakhmut for what, 50 times or even more. They've said that they've destroyed all our HIMARS systems. They've said that they've destroyed all our air defense systems. So this is propaganda, and we are seeing that they have, you know, faced with the inability to achieve any military success on the battlefield, they are intensifying the disinformation campaigns. But we treat them, you know, they're ridiculous. We just trust our official sources, and, you know, we don't trust Russian fakes.
Yuri Sack, thank you very much for your time.